Can everyone please take their seats? Thank you. Great, great. So good to see all of you this morning. I can't tell you how heartwarming it is to be at an event with people in person. To everyone who's with us virtually, good morning. And to those of you in the room, good morning. Welcome to the annual meeting of the Carter Center Board of Councilors. I am Sham Reddy, chair of the board. Today's meeting marks 34 years for the Board of Councilors. It is an extra special occasion because we are gathering in person for the first time since February 2020, which was the first and most recent time I chaired a meeting in person. It's so wonderful to see members and guests in person again, to engage in fellowship, and to facilitate some of the most important sharing of insights, knowledge, and data the Carter Center and all of its associates have to offer. Since our last in-person meeting in February 2020, a lot has happened, some of which I've touched on at our virtual meetings. Paige Alexander became president and CEO of the Carter Center. President and Mrs. Carter celebrated their 75th wedding anniversary. President Carter turned 96. The Carter Center worked on domestic elections for the first time to preserve civil society and our democracy. The Carter Center launched the Inform Women, Transform Lives campaign, and even something fun came out, a documentary called Jimmy Carter, Rock and Roll President. If you haven't seen it, you have to. It's really, really good. It's awesome. That's just the tip of the iceberg. Since the board was created by President and Mrs. Carter, Ivan Allen, and Beaufilet Jones, and Bob Holder, 733 members have served on the board and advanced the mission of the Carter Center. Our alumni and current members include some of the most distinguished and brightest leaders across Atlanta and the rest of America. Not surprisingly, I feel honored to be among them. Whether you are here in the day chapel or joining me online, on behalf of the Carter Center, let me thank you, all of you, for your intellectual engagement and your sincere interest in the work that's going on at the Carter Center. As counselors, we've been fortunate over 34 years to hear frank analysis of world events from a world leader, on top of hearing from experts working on some of the most difficult problems of our time, which touch on conflicts, public health issues, and voting rights, just to name a few. Today's meeting will be no different, as we have speakers ranging from Carter Center Board of Trustee Chair Jason Carter and our CEO, Paige Alexander. Although Jason and Paige are amazing and forces of nature in their own right, I am especially thrilled to yield the floor to three of our world-renowned experts, all of whom will share their work with you. Before we get started with their presentations, I'd like to welcome members of the diplomatic community. As I call your name, please stand if you're with us today, but let's hold our applause until the end. First, Consul General of the Netherlands, Ard van der Vorst. Consul General of Japan, Kazuyuki Takeuchi. Consul General of Belgium, Michel Gerenbetsov. Also, we welcome three Consuls General in Georgia, new ones. Consul General of Nigeria, Ambassador Amina Smaila. Consul General of Germany, Melanie Moltmann. And Consul General of Argentina, Juan Manuel Navarro. Are there any Consul Generals I've missed? Let's please give them a warm applause. Next, it's my pleasure to introduce our new members of the Board of Councilors that have been inducted this year. We welcomed several in February, and then the world shut down, and now we have a chance to welcome them all as a group. I'm delighted to introduce the entire group today. Brad Alexander of Impact Public Affairs, Sue Bolke, Informatech, Diana Ellsworth, McKinsey & Company, Daria Faruqi, Director of the Intercontinental Exchange and Intercontinental Hotels Group, Shayla Forte of Pandora Radio, Dr. Janine Franco, the Village Vets of Decatur, Dan Gordon at Jabian, Wab Kadaba at Kilpatrick, Townsend, and Stockton, Joe Kiani at Massimo Corporation, Sanjay Kumar at KPB Law, Mitch Lewis, a director at Blue Links Holdings in Gypsum Management and Supply, Sadea Mazyaberg at the Coca-Cola Foundation, Jim Marlowe at Clean Energy Advisors, Justice Harold Melton at Troutman Pepper Hamilton Sanders, Natalia Megal at Lease Plan USA, Amol Nayak at Squire Patton Boggs, Jason Perry at Grant Thornton, Mark Perung at Atlanta Beverage Company, Dr. Praveen Reddy at Reddy Aesthetic Institute, Sachin Shalendra at SG Contracting, Fahim Siddiqui at the Home Depot, Jewel Burke Solomon at Collab Capital, Laurie Speed at Speed and King Law Firm, Carol Tomei at UPS, William Vogel at Montag and Caldwell, and Chris Womack at Georgia Power. Let's give all of our new members a big and hearty round of applause. We also have a new and former Board of Councilors member who deserves special recognition, John Tien, who is a retired U.S. Army colonel and former managing director of Citigroup. He actually resigned his membership in June after being sworn in as the Deputy Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. We appreciate his service and are proud to have him as one of our alumni. Now I'm pleased to move forward with our program, which will touch on trachoma, mental health, and digital threats to our democracy. We'll then hear from Paige and from Jason. But first, Kim Jensen, our Associate Director of the Trachoma Program, will talk about the center's efforts to control trachoma in the Amhara region of Ethiopia. Next, we'll hear from Carrie Cobham, who will tell us about the Rosalynn Carter Fellowships for Mental Health Journalism, and introduce television reporter and anchor Bakari Savage. Next, we'll hear from Michael Schultens with the Democracy Program, where he will explain the digital threats to the Democracy Initiative. Once our esteemed colleagues are done with their presentations, we'll hear from Paige Alexander, our CEO, who will review program accomplishments in the last year and take questions. Now, I am very delighted to introduce our first speaker, Kim Jensen. Kim rejoined the Carter Center in 2019 as an associate director with our Trachoma Control Program. She came back home for all intents and purposes, as she worked in the guinea worm and the Trachoma Control Programs at the Carter Center in the past. Kim has also worked in global public health for Sightsavers International, the International Trachoma Initiative, and the CDC. She earned her bachelor's degree from University of Wisconsin, a Master of Arts at the University of Alcalá in Madrid, Spain, and her Master's in Public Health from the Rollins School of Public Health at Emory University. I'm looking forward to hearing your remarks, Kim. Please come on up.
Good morning, everyone. It's nice to take this off and hopefully see your faces a little bit later. For now, I get more light than I've seen in probably 18 months. So thank you, Sham. And as he said, my name is Kim Jensen. I'm one of the 2 associate directors for the Trachoma Control Program. And this morning, I just want to talk to you briefly about how we fight trachoma in Amhara, Ethiopia through MDA, and how our teams were able to do that despite the challenges of COVID-19. So just a brief summary of trachoma. Trachoma is the leading cause of infectious blindness worldwide. It is caused by the bacteria Chlamydia trachomatis, which can be transmitted from person to person by hands, shared cloths, or eye-seeking flies like you see in this photo. Over time, with repeated infections, the inside of the eyelid becomes scarred and eventually turns inward. This results in the eyelashes scratching the cornea with every blink. This is not only incredibly painful, but if left untreated, can lead to vision loss and total blindness. Children are more at risk from trachoma, and as the primary caretakers of children, women are also more at risk. They're in fact 2 to 3 times more likely to suffer from TT, which is the blinding stage of trachoma, than their male counterpart. People blinded from trachoma must rely on their family, particularly children, to help them in their household duties that they cannot manage by themselves. This may keep children from school, which is robbing them from their education. Currently, there are an estimated 137 million people worldwide living in trachoma endemic areas. The map on the left shows the problem in Africa, where nearly 90% of the global burden is found. The map on the right highlights Ethiopia, which is known as the most trachoma endemic country in the world. And outlined in red is the Amhara region, which is where the Carter Center has been assisting the region in fighting trachoma since 2001. We combat the blinding trachoma by utilizing the SAFE strategy endorsed by the World Health Organization called SAFE. This stands for surgery to correct TT, antibiotics to treat trachoma infection, facial cleanliness to decrease the ocular and nasal discharge that carries the bacteria, and environmental improvement to decrease the fly population that can transmit the infection from person to person. Today we're going to focus briefly on antibiotics. Mass Drug Administration, or MDA, is a significant part of the fight against trachoma. Antibiotics are key to treating and preventing the transmission of trachoma infection in communities. Since 2001, the Carter Center has assisted in the distribution of more than 220 million doses of antibiotics. That includes Zithromax, that's donated by Pfizer, and tetracycline eye ointment, or TEO. And of those 220 million doses, 200 million of them were distributed just in Amhara, Ethiopia. Even in a typical year, trachoma MDA in Amhara is no easy feat. It is a tremendous accomplishment that every year, an estimated 14 million people are treated with antibiotics for trachoma. The logistics of moving the antibiotics to the communities is not always easy and may take some different strategies. For example, some health workers may take their antibiotics and their MDA materials via truck, car, or bus, but some, like these women here, may have to strap them on a donkey to get them where they need to go. In the typical MDA approach, the health workers conduct MDA in a centralized location. This is usually in a health center. They call the surrounding communities together to provide a yearly dose of antibiotics to the entire eligible population. But in early 2020, the world turned upside down as COVID began spreading throughout the globe. And in April 2020, in an effort to decrease the risk of COVID transmission, the WHO advised that programs suspend mass campaigns, which brought large groups of people together. This meant that the typical MDA approach used in Amhara was no longer possible. In late July 2020, the WHO advised programs that they could restart campaign activities, but needed to ensure risk mitigation strategies for COVID-19. Knowing that MDA is key in combating trachoma and that we could not delay any further in the most trachoma endemic region in the world, the teams worked tirelessly to restart MDA activities in this new reality. One of the first big challenges the team had to face was trying to get the personal protective equipment, or PPE, needed to conduct these activities. The manufacturers in Ethiopia were working in overdrive to get these masks, but there was simply not enough. Thankfully, YKK donated N95 masks to both our trachoma program as well as our river blindness program to assist in covering the need until additional masks could be purchased. In addition to procuring the PPE to resume activities, the team also had to implement a risk mitigation and action tool, which was developed in partnership with other global trachoma partners. The tool assessed the level of risk and the actions needed to mitigate that risk before activities could resume. One key risk mitigation strategy was establishing new operating procedures with detailed necessary steps to follow to decrease the risk of COVID transmission during all activities. For MDA training, for example, this included providing masks, sanitizer, and temperature checks to participants, as well as including a supplemental COVID-19 training module. The most significant change that was related to MDA was the change from the centralized MDA strategy that we previously discussed to a house-to-house campaign. This was to decrease the number of people coming together in one place. Health workers, with the assistance of community volunteers, which form part of the Health Development Army, traveled house to house to treat individuals in their catchment area. During the visits, which took place outside to decrease the risk of COVID transmission, health workers asked community members a series of screening questions before proceeding to the height measurement and provision of antibiotics. Health workers also enlisted the support of community and religious leaders to notify the communities of the upcoming MDA to ensure individuals would stay home and participate in the MDA. The MDA teams had to carry all of the necessary materials from one house to the next. This included the bottles and tubes of Zithromax and TEO, the measuring stick to determine the dosage for each individual, the household registers to document all of the treatments, and the PPE and hand sanitizer to prevent transmission of COVID-19. Teams covered an average of 49 households a day, with some visiting fewer due to the challenging mountainous terrain of their catchment area. This MDA approach required tremendous dedication from the health workers, but some did even more. If you see the picture on the right, this health worker is conducting TT screening. When possible, health workers documented those they found with TT so that we could organize a surgical outreach at a later date. Thanks to the effort of the dedication of the MDA teams, in early 2021, despite the challenges of COVID-19, a total of 14.9 million people were treated in Amhara for trachoma. And this dedication is why we are seeing progress in Amhara. Due to the efforts of MDA and FNE to date, we are seeing great progress toward the elimination of trachoma as a public health problem. The upper left map shows the baseline trachoma prevalence. There are different categories of the prevalence of disease, but what we need to know is we're hoping for green. At the baseline, there was no green, which meant every district was endemic for trachoma, and essentially everyone was at risk of going blind of trachoma. Since then, we've been moving closer to elimination as more and more green appears on the map in the most recent map on the right. But this isn't just progress on a map. This represents more than 5 million people who no longer have to receive MDA for trachoma. This represents the people who will not suffer from TT because of our MDA efforts. And this represents the children who do not have to fear that they will lose sight because of trachoma or their family or friends will lose sight as well. But when we think of progress, we can't just think of the people who receive the MDA, but those who make it possible. I get to be up here today to tell you all about the work, but these are the people who actually make it happen. The work that's being done in Amhara could not be done without these people. It's the community members, the local government leaders, our Carter Center Ethiopia staff. These people and so many more spend countless hours dedicated to the work, planning, leading, and participating in trainings, managing the distribution of millions of doses of antibiotics, and implementing surveys to assess the progress towards elimination. These faces represent the tens of thousands of people who, in a typical year, work tirelessly to eliminate trachoma. And when faced with the challenges of COVID-19, they've done even more. The accomplishments during this challenging time not only push us forward towards elimination, but they give us hope that elimination is in fact possible. Elimination is not an easy endeavor. We all know that at the Carter Center. But it takes dedication. And if we've learned anything in the last year and a half, we know that in Amhara, dedication is not in short supply. Thank you.
Thank you. You know, what struck me in listening to that presentation was, you know, last year the Carter Center was involved in domestic elections and took its international experience around election monitoring and brought it to the United States. And it's fascinating, actually. It's so great that the Carter Center has this incredible global expertise around healthcare delivery. And so on some level, maybe there's an opportunity for Kim and her team and the rest of the Carter Center folks to bring their healthcare expertise to the United States and help us improve our delivery mechanisms, because with our rural communities and many other challenges that they face, as well as those in the cities around receiving healthcare, there's no doubt in my mind that the Carter Center could probably tackle that pretty successfully. In any event, the work that you and your teams are doing to eradicate trachoma is extraordinary, Kim, and we applaud you. Now we'll hear from Carrie Cobham. Carrie joined the Carter Center in 2019 as a Senior Associate Director for the Rosalynn Carter Fellowships for Mental Health Journalism and Media. Carrie has more than a decade of experience in journalism, digital storytelling, and newsroom leadership. She worked previously as a Senior Manager of Digital Content for the Cox Media Group and as an Executive Producer at the ABC affiliate in Orlando. Carrie earned her bachelor's degree from Bethune-Cookman University and her master's degree in mass communications from the University of Central Florida. Carrie, why don't you come on up?
Good morning. It is good to be with you today. As always, September is a busy month for the Rosalynn Carter Fellowships for Mental Health Journalism as we host the annual training event for our fellows. This is the second year that we are hosting the 3-day event virtually to train fellows on mental health reporting before they go off to report on a behavioral health topic of their choice. This year, we've rebranded the program's flagship event to RCJF 21 Learning Lab. And we welcome top-notch journalists from across the United States, Brazil, Costa Rica, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates. They'll report on some of society's most pressing behavioral health issues, from the impact of border restrictions on mourning to school-based behavioral health right here in Georgia. When Mrs. Carter founded the fellowships in 1996 to support journalists reporting on mental health, she wanted to destigmatize and open up the public discourse around mental health. Perhaps she envisioned the more than 225 journalism fellows from the US, New Zealand, Romania, South Africa, and other partner countries who would now be out in the world doing the work years later. Perhaps she envisioned the changes they'd affect on policy, on communities, and on lives. But none of us could envision how the world and the mental health landscape would have changed over the last 18 months as the pandemic touched us all. And above all, we know how vital it is for everyone to have access to behavioral health care services if we are to survive the pandemic. Today, you'll hear from Bakari Savage, one of this year's fellows. He is curious, dedicated, empathetic, and an incredible journalist. We are honored and proud to have him with us today. Bakari Savage is an anchor reporter for CP24 Toronto's Breaking News. He was previously a correspondent for the top-rated morning show in Birmingham, Alabama at WBRC Fox 6 On Your Side. Bakari has been the weekend morning co-host for Good Day Carolinas at Fox-owned and operated WJZY TV in Charlotte, North Carolina, as well as the morning show at WJXT in Jacksonville, Florida. He's a public speaker, a mentor, and junior board member for the Bell Center for Early Intervention Programs. He also sits on the board of Smile a Mile, a nonprofit that supports children with cancer and their families, and River Time, which empowers children of abuse and neglect. Born and raised in Birmingham, Bakari is a graduate of the University of Minnesota Twin Cities and a member of the Sigma Chi fraternity. Over the past year, amid global crises, a job change, an international move, and deep loss very close to home, Bakari worked on his fellowship project, a documentary on pandemic mental health as told through the lens of real people in Bakari's life and in his community. Please join me in welcoming Rosalynn Carter Fellow, Bakari Savage.
Hello, my name is Bakari Savage. I'm a 2020-2021 Rosalynn Carter Mental Health Journalism Fellow. What is mental health versus mental illness? And how do we or don't we talk about it? You know, in my grandparents' neighborhood, you might hear something like, they're just crazy, or, you know, they're not quite right. Whereas on a TED stage, you'll hear from someone like Dr. Susan David, who teaches emotional agility and the power of words, and saying things like, I'm noticing that I'm feeling sad instead of I'm sad. This is 2021, and this fellowship, the Rosalynn Carter Fellowship for Mental Health Journalism, gave me a very unique opportunity and the chance to explore and redefine how we, as a society, look at and talk about mental health. In doing so, I was able to use life during the pandemic of COVID-19, its isolation and subsequent effects on us as a lens. And when I say us, I mean just that. I took this unique opportunity, and you've heard me say this before, you're going to hear me say it again, because this is something that I'm not sure I or any of the fellows before or after me will ever have the pleasure, the responsibility to experience again. For my fellowship, I reached out to 16 people ranging from ages 11 to 48, whom I've had some sort of personal connection with, friends, relatives that I've never met before, past coworkers, my nurse, all people that I'm personally connected to. For the past 9 months, we've been on an emotional journey of self-discovery, mental health awareness. Using the platform in demo, I would record tasks, asking questions, which force us to talk about our feelings and emotions when it comes to things such as, how are the holidays different under COVID lockdown, weight gain during the pandemic, how the termination of my wife Jamie's pregnancy forced us to look differently at our mental health, and the effects of the new reality of social distancing and wearing masks in public. This was for the video diary portion, which ended September 3rd. In mid-October, my editor, photographer, and I will travel around to complete in-person interviews with everyone. This will all come together with the work of Dr. Matt Macaluso, Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Neurobiology at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. Macaluso will provide clinical analysis and solutions via the ECHO program for community outreach, providing mental health resources. Before showing you a preview of my work so far, I'd like to tell you about Olivia Johnson. She's a college sophomore. She's not just one of the subjects. Olivia is the impetus for this. I've known Olivia since she was a baby, but we really only reconnected maybe a few years ago. Her mom was my advisor for the JCPenney Teen Board when I was in high school. And we've always kept in touch. Just before applying for this fellowship, I had lunch with Olivia and her parents. While we sat at this nice restaurant, Olivia was very candid about her struggles with depression, yet it seemed to make her parents uncomfortable. However, Olivia owned her story, and she forced us all to sit there and listen to her reality, one that really shouldn't make any of us uncomfortable. Talk about mental health should be a routine part of our everyday language and conversation. After all, Nike has very boldly offered a mental health break to employees by giving them the week off. On the heels of their Just Do It campaign, here's a sneak peek of Olivia's story, my story, and that of more than a dozen other people I know across America and Canada.
Hi, my name's Brandon Denny. I'm from Birmingham, Alabama, and I live in Nashville, Tennessee right now.
I guess the toughest thing for me with COVID during 2020, it brought a lot of emotions like denial in the beginning.
When I think about the word new normal, sometimes it makes me sad, sometimes it makes me happy. If I'm talking about what makes me sad about it, it's just the fact that it can't go back to the way it was.
We're dealing with a little bit more financial pressure because we own a business, and we're at about half capacity for our after-school programs and camps right now.
From a business perspective, actually one of our clients passed away from COVID, so that's been really, really sad.
For me, since I'm a very social person, it was not a thing for me. It was just so hard being on my computer all day, just doing work when the teacher's not right there talking to me. It was so hard.
So we had a good cry about that when I had to go buy new clothes. That one was rough because that one was real rough because it's just like I knew and I know that it's like an eating disorder,
I feel like I definitely had a lot more mental health challenges at the beginning, but of COVID, just because, you know, I wasn't seeing my friends anymore, a lot was changing that was supposed to happen.
So my new year was not great. Imagine hating your job and then they give you COVID.
That was basically my experience over the past year, and life has definitely changed.
Through this project, the tangible goals I hope to affect are the following: universal leave, funding for peer support, and greater access to mental health resources. The intangible is not only affecting, but effecting the shift in zeitgeist when it comes to how we all think and talk about mental health. Elaborating on the tangible, universal leave would give employees the option to take mental health days without worry of job security as it relates to the stigma around mental health. Funding for peer support programs, where people who have lived experience with mental health illness are helping others going through the same. The UAB's Project ECHO is chaired by Dr. Macaluso, providing mental health support for underserved communities. In closing, when this airs during a special presentation on WBRC Fox 6 News in Birmingham, Alabama, in December, this will be the impetus to spark conversation among our own social circles, other than just asking, are you okay? And having this be the beginning of the conversation about mental health. Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie. You know, even though I have a background in public health can span the gamut of different issues to touch on. It's been fantastic to be part of an organization that focuses on mental health through Rosalynn Carter's work, because it's helped inspire me to implement mental health programs and interventions and support at the company where I work at, where we have spent a fair amount of time focused on mental health during the pandemic and giving all of our associates a number of resources and encouragement to actually take advantage of those resources in order to make sure that their mental health stays strong, just like we encourage them on the physical side. So thank you, Carrie. Thank you, Bakari. It's always nice to have journalists leverage their platforms to shine a light on mental health issues for society at large and to bring people from the community into that conversation. Now, on to Michael Schultens, one of our tech wizards. Michael joined the Carter Center in 2016 as an intern in the democracy program. He was then hired as a program associate to support electoral observation missions and other work in several African countries. In 2019, Michael joined the Syria Conflict Mapping Project to support conflict resolution in the region. In 2020, Michael rejoined the democracy program as a data analyst. He earned his bachelor's degree from Emory University, his master's of science in international relations from the University of Edinburgh, and is currently pursuing a master's in analytics from Georgia Tech. Michael, why don't you come on up? It seems like everybody at the Carter Center has at least 3 degrees.
Thank you, Sham. I'm not sure if I'm a tech wizard, but I'm very happy to be here today, and I thank you all for attending and giving me the opportunity to talk about the Digital Threats to Democracy project here at the Carter Center. In recent years, countless democracies around the globe have faced increasing threats from online spaces, where authoritarian actors have been able to warp our reality and oppress or suppress opposition voices with alarming efficacy. We've seen this in many countries around the globe, including the United States, where these efforts on social media have not been something divorced from our politics, but a primary component of a new political reality that pose challenges to democratic institutions and to those who hope to protect them. Whenever the Carter Center recognized these new threats, we realized that we had to develop new approaches to supporting democracies in the 21st century. And whenever we use the phrase digital threats, What that really means in its most essence is just something that's connected to the internet and can do harm. But in the context of democracy, what we see are these kind of 5 categories, and it's mis and disinformation, hate speech, internet shutdowns, cyber surveillance, and cyber attacks. And perhaps the least surprising inclusion on this list is mis and disinformation. Misinformation just being the ignorant sharing of false information, and disinformation being false information that has an agenda. And this is included on this list for good reason, because reliable, verifiable, and credible information is the absolute lifeblood of election integrity and democratic institutions. And so anything that undermines this information has the ability to destabilize the system as a whole. We've also focused on hate speech. Unfortunately, hate speech often targets women and minorities and reduces their political participation. And that's not just as voters, but as candidates and also accessing government services. And so you see democracies and governments that are less representative and serve people who need them the most improperly. We've also seen, with increasing frequency, internet shutdowns around the globe. And whenever we use the phrase internet shutdowns, we don't mean the failure of the internet due to infrastructural problems caused by natural disasters or conflict, but an actual physical turning off of the tap. And so governments around the globe have now had the ability to turn off the internet either for the entire country or for certain regions. And this is often done to censor opposition or to reduce coordination between civil society organizations, and ultimately reduce everyone's in the entire country's access to their freedom of speech. The final 2 categories, while distinct threats in and of themselves, both threaten the same right to privacy. Cyber surveillance is obviously something that we're all quite familiar with, but is often used to intimidate and to silence opposition by centralizing information and control within a government or an organization. And cyber attacks are almost the other side of that coin. They threaten centralization of information by exposing it to a wider audience, one that it was never intended for and who might use it maliciously. And so in light of these threats, what are the digital threats to democracy team doing? As a reflection of the importance of countering dis and misinformation, the digital threats team has largely focused on countering and mitigating these harmful narratives. And while these efforts look different in many different countries in scope, size, and methodology, the most common approach that we've used has been relying on local partners to develop monitoring teams where we establish a monitoring environment for them using a software platform called Aggie. And now Aggie is a platform that we've developed in concert with Georgia Tech, and it allows us to pull in multiple streams of information from Facebook, from Instagram, from Twitter, and allow monitoring teams in each country to review content in real time as it comes in and to identify patterns in misinformation. We then take that information and we have about 2 main mitigation efforts. And one is we have relationships with the major social media platforms. And so whenever something is particularly egregious, we can escalate that to them and say, this needs to be removed or downranked. Unfortunately, we don't have the arbitrary or control over that. However, what we've seen is that oftentimes things are downranked, and that's a good balance between maintaining the freedom of speech, but also reducing visibility of harmful narratives. We also are able to escalate issues that involve a stakeholder that we actually have a relationship with. One example of this was in Ethiopia, where our monitor team identified a harmful narrative that involved the resignation of a member of the election board. And this didn't seem to be accurate. We were aware, we were talking with the election board themselves. We reached out to them and they confirmed that this was in fact not true. And so they were able to immediately publish a press release and push out on their social media and through our organization's social media to say that this was in fact not true, and we were able to blunt the effect of the original narrative before it caught steam. We've also worked with local partners to counter hate speech in Ecuador, particularly against female candidates. And we've developed a online toolkit that will help future organizations carry out this similar work. Another aspect of misinformation that's often misunderstood is micro-targeting and social media political advertising. Most of the campaign finance law around the world was written in a time before anyone can even imagine what micro-targeting was, and it was written for television and radio and print ads. And so there's legal gaps around the globe as to what's permissible and what can be done and what should be done. And in Bolivia, we actually monitored Facebook advertising closely and found that most of the politicians and parties were running ads likely in contravention to their campaign finance laws during the campaign silence period, and oftentimes with harmful narratives about other candidates as well. And finally, we have a partnership with Cloudflare, which I'm sure many of you within your own businesses are familiar with that organization, that business, through their cybersecurity work. However, their access to internet infrastructure data about the amount of traffic that's going through the internet allows us to get a very, very close look at when internet shutdowns occur and where they're occurring and whether or not it's something that's due to infrastructure failure or if it's something that's actively being controlled. And so we, in a partnership with Cloudflare, they're able to let us know whenever internet shutdowns occur, and we are able to advocate alongside our partners and the diplomatic community for the resumption of service. And so these are very high-level examples of what we're doing, and so I'd like to leave you with a couple of very concrete analyses that we've conducted in the last couple of missions to give you an idea of how this analysis can be used to advocate for better outcomes. And the first one I have here is an analysis of Botnet in Honduras. And so what I mean by a botnet is all of the small dots that you see on this graphic representation up here are Twitter accounts that have been identified by an artificial intelligence model to not be humans. And so these are all automated accounts that we identified in Honduras, or likely automated accounts. And all the larger circles that are labeled are the Twitter accounts of the major Honduran political parties. And so all those lines show which accounts follow the major accounts in Honduras, major political accounts. And while this looks like a jumbled mess, and I wouldn't disagree with you, but what this shows us is that these islands in the middle, where there are shared Facebook groups, or not Facebook groups, Twitter users, are Twitter users that are automated accounts shared between political parties that are on opposite ends of the political spectrum and are in opposition to one another. And it's impossible to say for sure why this is the case, but the likely explanation is that they have hired the same firm, whether it's a marketing or consultant firm, that run these bots accounts and have used them to boost their numbers, to increase the visibility of their content artificially, and try to promote their messaging ahead of the primary campaign earlier this year. And so this is the kind of information that we're able to identify and let Twitter know so that they can do a deeper investigation and potentially remove these accounts that are engaging what's referred to as computational propaganda. The second example I'd like to give is a little bit closer to home, and this is based on our work here in the United States. We monitored Facebook during the election and subsequent months up through January 6th, and we reviewed over 800 Facebook groups and over 5 million Facebook posts that occurred in those groups. And these groups were all identified as being closely linked to users that were engaging actively with the official political party pages, both Democratic and Republican. So this is a sample of both sides of the aisle. And what we see here on the bottom is the time frame from September to January, and on the left is the number of Facebook users that may have been exposed to that content. And the content that we're tracking here is content from web pages that were shared on Facebook that are known to repeatedly and purposely share false narratives, as identified by NewsGuard, which is an external organization that does this work. And what we can see is something that might seem familiar to your intuition, which is the tension that we felt throughout the election and in the months that followed is reflected in the data here. And so I would never suggest that there's a causation. However, we can see that there seems to be a direct connection between the online and offline worlds. And so there very well may be a contributing factor whenever it comes to online discourse and how the tensions increased up until January 6th. And you can see that we have a precipitous fall off and a chastening after that moment online. So in light of these threats and the work we've already done, where are we hoping to go? The digital threats team recognizes that these are amorphous threats. As new technologies come online and new methodologies from authoritarian actors are also employed, we realize that we have to adapt and learn quickly. And for that reason, we are already pursuing advanced artificial intelligence solutions with our partners to try to increase the amount of content that we can monitor. As I mentioned before, our monitoring teams are a series of humans who can only see so much content in a day. And so we'd like to develop AI solutions to increase the efficiency of this work, and we're working with Microsoft to this end already. So far, most of our activity is reactive, unfortunately. And so we'd also like to work on developing a next generation media literacy curriculum that works as an inoculation against this kind of narrative for people who are open to understanding how these things are trying to rely on outrage and trying to promote you to click share whenever really, if you took just a split second, you might decide not to. And then finally, both for ourselves, our partners, and for governments, we're advocating for good data governance and data security protection. Because at the end of the day, all of this information, if it becomes centralized, if you collect the wrong kinds of information or too much information and then it becomes unsecure, then that's a threat to everyone's right to privacy. And so in conclusion, we hope that through the identified digital threats, we're able to evolve through time to support democracies in an effective way and modernize our election observation work going forward. Thank you so much.
That's just extraordinary. It's sobering to hear, but then he ends with a message of hope and all the work that the Carter Center is going to do to mitigate against these threats. Thank you, Michael, for all the work you're doing to advance or promote civil society and protect our democracy. Next up is Paige. So Paige Alexander joined the Carter Center as CEO in June 2020, continuing a distinguished global development career with over 2 decades of experience spanning the government and nonprofit sectors. I've known Paige for several years, and the Carter Center is very fortunate to have landed her now. Her skill sets are considerable and just right for the global pandemic. Paige has pointed out that the pivot to virtual has allowed her to have daily interactions with a much larger part of the Carter Center staff, even if only in a 2-dimensional format. She is convinced that after a year of watching faces with name tags on the screen, she will know everyone by name when people are back in the office. She has held senior leadership positions at the USAID, overlapping 3 separate presidential administrations. She has enjoyed multiple Senate confirmations for her roles at USAID, leading first the Europe and Eurasia Bureau, and later the Middle East and North Africa Bureau. In both positions, she oversaw thousands of employees, programs in over 40 countries around the world, and more than $2 billion in budgets of U.S. foreign assistance. Between her assignments with USAID, Ms. Alexander was Senior Vice President and European founder of IREX, an international civil society, democracy, and education nonprofit. Immediately before we lured Paige back to Atlanta and the Carter Center, she served as Executive Director of the European Cooperative for Rural Development in Brussels and Amsterdam, working to improve the livelihoods of farmers, families, and communities in Africa. As many of you know, Paige is an Atlanta native, but has traveled and lived around the world for 35 years before Atlanta, and this job drew her back home. On a more personal note, Paige and her husband, Steve, are close personal friends. Her father, Miles Alexander, a lifetime member of the Board of Councilors, is a mentor and former law partner of mine. Her brother, Kent Alexander, and more importantly, her mother, Elaine Alexander, have counseled me numerous times over the years as I've made my way over the course of my career. I'm also on the Board of Trustees of the U.S. German Marshall Fund, which is where Steve, Paige's husband, served in leadership positions early in his career. So it's a real privilege and honor to bring my good friend, Paige Alexander, to the stage to share her insights and words of wisdom with all of you this morning. Paige?
Thanks. Well, it is great to be here. One of my jokes has been that when I was interviewing for this job, the selection committee required that I do a first Board of Councilors meeting and present to everybody. And I was so nervous for that, I did not realize it would take 16 months before I actually had people in person to do that too. But before I start, let me actually ask if Jason would come up and give a little update on his grandparents, and we can take it from there.
That's a note for you. Not from me. I'm a courier. It's wonderful to see people here in person. It's great to have it be a more intimate group. I'm glad, of course, that there's so many folks at home as well, so thank you very much. Just as a brief update, number one, it is thrilling for me to hear and see the great work that has continued over the last year, as we haven't been able to get together, as you've seen. However, in Amhara, for example, we have continued to do remarkable work. As Sham pointed out, sometimes the delivery mechanisms are more effective in northern Ethiopia than they are in Fulton County or DeKalb County, Georgia, sometimes. And then Carrie and Michael, thank you guys for all the work that you guys have continued to do virtually otherwise. My grandparents, just to give a quick update, we went to their 75th anniversary, and I hope everybody gets to have a 75th anniversary. It was a remarkable event. They are doing incredibly well. My grandfather is physically not able to do the things that he wants to be doing, but he is in great spirits. And I just talked to him yesterday, and I'll say one of the reasons, and this is the thing I'll share, and then I'll give it back to Paige, just yesterday we sort of renewed our monthly calls with the founders of the center to give them an update on what has been going on at the center, and we talked about getting home eradication. We gave some of the reports that you've just gotten here, and at the end I said, "All right, Papa, well, I love you." And he said, "Well, I love you too, especially even more after that report." So they're doing great. The legacy that they have left, the track record of this organization, and Paige's great leadership at this point has really demonstrated what a healthy, remarkable organization we have, even without their active involvement. So they are enjoying their retirement and excited to send their best to all of you at home and to all of you guys here. So thanks, Paige, and thanks to everybody else. Yep.
Yeah, I was assuming when President Carter said, "I love you," especially after that report, that "I love you" was for you, and the "after that report" was for me. So that was my takeaway. So it is great to be here. I think, it's hard to follow Jason in his tour de force that he did back in February 2020 when we last got together. But let me take an opportunity to have a little bit of a conversation about why I came here and why we have all of you here as part of the Board of Councilors. One of the reasons, Sham went through my resume, including my family here in Atlanta, but one of the reasons I'm here is because of the reputation of the Carter Center. I have worked almost as long as the Carter Center has been around in democracy and human rights. And so I knew when I was in a foreign country, if the Carter Center was there looking at elections, that it was going to be critical and that it was going to be truthful, and the final report would truly speak truth to power. So moving forward after 114 elections in 40 different countries, it was one of the conversations that Jason and I had early with President and Mrs. Carter down in Plains in June of 2020. And I came back here and said, we will not be credible overseas if we don't look in our own backyard. So to some of what Michael has actually presented, these are the things that we were looking at in this last election. And so our reputation of being an honest broker meant that we were able to go in as the only nonpartisan, credentialed by the Secretary of State group to go in to look at the audit when it was happening here in Georgia. And I was in Fannin County, I was in DeKalb, I was in Fulton, and I can tell you I could have been in any foreign country anywhere watching administrators administer the election, count the ballots. It was fascinating, but it was something I felt that we had to do here. And so after President Carter said, do not spend all my money, which I think many people know and are fond of hearing him say, we really did take a deep dive very quickly into this. And that's part of what our reputation is. I also, on the health side, I contacted a former mentor of mine, Brian Atwood, who is the administrator at AID, and said, I'm looking at going into the Carter Center, I'm going through this process, and he's writing his memoirs, so he sent me a letter of a first meeting he had with President Carter when AID funded Guinea worm. And that's when it was 3.5 million people a year in 21 countries were affected by this disease. And Brian said at the time, yeah, it was a moonshot. I can't believe that President Carter thought he could eradicate a human disease, only smallpox, the only disease ever eradicated. And here we are in 2021 with 5 cases in 4 countries. It is so close. And so that is the reputation that the Carter Center has. You know, we've had 38 years of a North Star with doing global health and peace, and we haven't changed. We haven't jumped off to do Iraq or Afghanistan or do areas that aren't within our purview. We've had this nice organic growth where if we're talking about environmental issues and talking about water scarcity, how does that affect the conflict mitigation programs that we're running? How do we have those conversations about how water affects conflict? So we've had this organic growth. So reputation was the first one. The second one is our ground game. It is really impressive to me. We've got 3,100 staff people. That is a lot. So as we were talking about, and you know, as we've been talking about today, how we get our Mectizan treatments, our ivermectin, how we get these things to the field is incredibly important. 200 million doses in Amara is indicative of trying to do all of this, and that's just trachoma. It doesn't talk about river blindness. It doesn't talk about getting the cloth filters to the end of the road for guinea worm, or getting to that last polling station, or those Mectizan tablets. All of that is part of a whole conversation that we have with our field staff. And that has been, our ground game is truly there. I remember seeing something that Melinda Gates had interview with David Letterman, and he said, what is the most important thing you've learned about the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation? What type of advice did you take? And she said, I spoke to President Carter, and he said, it's all about the people on the ground. It's all about working that way. And that is something that we have been known to do for 38 years. And it's also what we did when we look at the guinea worm ceasefire in 1995 in Sudan. The fact that we were able to have conversations on the ground to get a ceasefire going and create one of the first humanitarian corridors to get our programs through during 1995 was amazing. Fast forward to 2021. We're in the Blue Nile region. No one's been there in 10 years. We were able to negotiate a conversation with the Sudanese government and with SPLNA and have that discussion so we can now go in and look at river blindness treatments. And so that's the beginning of a discussion. If you can start that by putting our peace programs together with our health programs, that nexus on the ground is incredibly important. The third area is our partners. I have been absolutely amazed at the reliance that we've had on our country staff. As we were all worried about the bubbles that we were trying to create back here domestically during COVID, our staff worried about the people on the ground. But those bubbles were already created, so we didn't need the supervisory visits that we would usually have. We realized that we had created this cadre of people on the ground to have these conversations, to be able, you know, as long as we could get the masks out with YKK's help and with the US government's help, we could get the drugs out with Merck and Pfizer, we were still able to get to the people on the ground, and our staff there were able to do it. And it's been a game changer. It's a big difference. It's a real differentiator between us and other nonprofit organizations who didn't have that. They pulled all their staff back and the programs ended, and that wasn't our issue. I have not been able to get to the field yet, but I have seen a lot of videos, and as you can see from the pictures that we were sharing, that Kim shared about the mules taking the drugs out, you can look at our videos and you can see how we have laid runways in Venezuela and the Amazon to get drugs to the end of the road. And these are incredibly important things, so I recommend that you look at some of our videos online. And the last is our donors and supporters as far as why I am here. And it's the reason all of you are here as well. I will tell you that, you know, when you come into an organization, as Sham said, you've got people with multiple degrees. They could be working anywhere. They could be at corporations, they could be private sector, they could be doing a number of things. But they are here because we have an idealistic staff. And that is what you can recognize, is that our staff are here for all the right reasons. They're doing these projects. They are in the trenches. They have always been in the trenches. Most of them have lived overseas, as many of my colleagues have, for an extended period of time before coming back here. And they've been at both sides of the table, as we would say in corporate America. They understand these conversations that they're having, and they have cultural sensitivity. And that, to me, is one of the reasons I love being here. 92% of our program funds go to programs. They don't go to overhead. They don't go to pay for these brilliant experts that we have. They actually go to our programs on the ground. And that makes me really excited to be here. We've had a number of pivots that we've taken in, whether it was domestic work, as Michael talked about, whether it's recognizing, which I'm sure Mrs. Carter did not expect over 200 mental health fellows when she started 50 years ago, saying mental health was an area we needed to walk into. I don't think that she realized the effect that COVID would have and the effect that we need to have to destigmatize mental health for all of us. And so the fact that we've grown these programs has been remarkable. And it's all because we have the support of our donors and our supporters. And I welcome you to ask questions now, because I think that's part of this has really been, we don't have President Carter up here, but we've got Jason, we have myself, we have our experts. We'd love to take questions and have that conversation with you. So you feel comfortable about the Carter Center, you feel comfortable talking about even just one program or one video you saw, so you can say as a Board of Counselor that you understand what we do. President Carter has never been one to chest thump and to talk about the work that he's doing, but we want to talk about it. And so in that respect, it's a new day. We want to push it out there. We want people to understand what we're doing, and we want you to be part of that voice. So before we go to Q&As, I was given a note, housekeeping. There are microphones around there. They will be wiped down, and I really encourage all of you to ask questions. And we've got a panel of experts up here. We've got folks in the audience as well. So with that, I'm not sure, Sham, if I'm turning it over to you or if we're just going straight to questions. It's a quiet group. The coffee didn't flow as quickly. No, Jason, if you're going to ask a question, the thing is over there or here.
Very exciting, very impressive. Thank you. I'm Laura Heary. I'm very interested in the social media subversion of democracy and the program intersection with other programs. If you can talk to Freedom House, has their annual report, Freedom on the Net, 65 countries, that collects data about government interference. And then also, I think there's the Institute of Cyber Peace and Security in Geneva. If you can tell us about how you intersect with other organizations.
Sure. Great. Yeah. Why don't you start, Michael?
Absolutely. So we have had conversations since the inception of the project with a number of organizations, including some of the ones you mentioned. We have, I think, the number of partnerships that I talked about in the presentation is only a small fraction of the conversations that we've had. And a lot of these things, there might not be any concrete programming as of yet, because everyone's still figuring out how to do this work. I mean, the harsh reality is that we were caught off guard in 2016 originally, whenever we were first really alerted to how serious these issues were. And so we've been playing a little bit of catch up. And so all of our organizations and talking to each other have been trying to workshop methodologies for monitoring. What's the best way to engage with content once it's been identified? And so a lot of these partnerships, we're all still trying to figure out our own game. And so we haven't had any kind of formal engagement, say, with Freedom House on their work, but we've certainly discussed this with them. And so we're all kind of, as a community of practice, working together to come up with methodologies that work best for this work.
Yeah, and I will jump in there to say, we're part of something called Partnership for American Democracy, and it's got groups like Freedom House and for-profit foundations, private sector, coming together to say, how can we use this information we have? Because we have a lot of information now, as you saw on the slide. We've had conversations with Freedom House in advance. September 18th last year, Jason was part of a conversation we did with Freedom House. and a number of other Washington-based, Freedom House, Bush Center. I was trying to figure out exactly who we spoke with. And we got the boards together, our board of trustees, their board of trustees, and we had this conversation because we know it's coming down the pike. But what can we as international development organizations do, especially in the local and domestic context? We want to be careful about that because we have a group of incredibly knowledgeable international experts, but how you move that domestically, and we don't want to entirely pivot and make ourselves a domestic organization. We don't have that skill set, but we do have so many lessons from overseas. What we've seen in Myanmar that has been happening this year is actually very relevant to what's happening here in the use of the web. So the partnerships that Michael mentioned that we have are incredibly important to figure out the what next piece of it. And that's where we're going to be going during 2021 and 2022, I think, in advance of 2024. So thanks, Laura. Other questions? Sure. This is always going to be good.
Jason Carter. And this is also for Michael, and I think, number one, Paige, it was important for all of us to know that when the Carter Center decided to engage in domestic politics, how crucially important it was for us to sort of bolster our neutrality, given the fact that we were founded by a Democratic president who has his own ideas about everything. But also the fact that this is a nonprofit organization that has to operate in a neutral and nonpartisan way. We did engage with the George W. Bush Center, the McCain Institute, Freedom House, a bunch of other sort of what you would consider to be right-leaning domestically organizations. And one of the questions that I have for Michael about all this is when we're talking about mis or disinformation, and we're talking about when something is anti-democratic versus freedom of speech, for example, or how do we draw those lines? I know you've thought a lot about it, and it is important that you don't censor things that are anti-democratic any more than you censor things that are democratic. So how do you confront that philosophically, and what's the plan there?
So I think that this is something that a lot of people are thinking about, including, and unfortunately or fortunately, a lot of this conversation is happening at the social media platform level and not in kind of the halls of Congress and stuff like that, although they're also thinking about this. And what we've seen is, first of all, I'd like to speak just very briefly on the kind of neutrality issue. The data that fed that graphic that we were shown was pulled from both right-leaning and left-leaning Facebook groups, echo chambers, if you will, that we identified. And so in 97% of groups, regardless of political affiliation, were exposed to some measure of disinformation during the election campaign. And so it's a problem across both sides of the political spectrum. And then whenever you discuss kind of how do you deal with censorship, I think one thing is that we realize that we're alone shouldn't be the arbiter of what is acceptable and unacceptable, which is why we've relied more heavily on partnerships with people who are better equipped to do that kind of work. And so I mentioned briefly that we partner with NewsGuard on identifying some of the most harmful sources of information, and their methodology is incredibly rigorous when it comes to identifying websites that have a malicious intent whenever it comes to sharing their information, whether that's to incite an insurrection even. And so their methodology involves fact-checking through journalists, lifetime career journalists that fact-check the information. Once it's been fact-checked, they actually make contact with that organization and say, we have fact-checked your information. We've determined that it's incorrect. Are you willing to retract and correct your future behavior? If they then fail to clear that bar, which is a pretty high bar, whenever they made direct contact, discussed things with the actual organization themselves, then they label them as what they refer to as a repeat offender, and someone who obviously has malicious intent whenever it comes to sharing information and creating false narratives. And so that's currently the bar that we used, at least for that graphic, and that is the bar that we're suggesting could be a starting place for a discussion whenever it comes to at least limiting the visibility of content.
Yeah, and I will make one correction because I can just see our democracy program staff going crazy. We don't work in domestic elections. We work in don't work in domestic politics. We work in domestic elections. So we're not political. Just putting that out there. More questions? I know we had some people.
We actually got some other questions that came in online, and just on the digital threat side. Given the technical nature of assessing digital threats, Michael, which could potentially be done remotely as opposed to in-country assessments, does the Carter Center still hold by its rule to always be invited by a country's government, election authority, and political parties?
So yeah, that's a good question. Some of the work that we've done, like the analysis that you saw in Honduras, was done remotely, and so obviously we can collect that information using what's called an API, which is essentially just a way to ask for data from Twitter. And so we were able, once we had the kind of targets that we wanted to collect, we were able to collect that information and do the analysis. However, we actually did have people on the ground in Honduras that were liaising with kind of representatives of the political party, the diplomatic community, the regular stakeholders in any kind of election mission. And so we do generally like to hew closer to having some kind of presence in the country as well, primarily because most social media data, particularly if it's not in English, is inaccessible to a lot of our analysis team. I speak 1.5 languages, and I don't speak enough Arabic to read it well enough for social media memes. And so we need in-country teams to be able to parse that context. And so that's one of the reasons we rely so heavily on in-country monitoring teams. And then whenever it comes to being invited, if we have that in-country component, then we absolutely would like to have in-country invitations to be able to do that work.
Yeah, and I will, just to piggyback on that, a couple of things. One, we're looking at the Venezuela elections right now, and I'll tell you, only the UN, the European Union, and the Carter Center have received invitations from the Maduro government, and that was a change that they actually are interested in having us come in. So we're starting with a remote assessment to figure out if we know it can be a critical election, but if we can do it legitimately and be able to have the voice that we usually expect to have. I'll tell you, at any given time, the Carter Center's been active in 80 countries, and at any given time, we've got projects in about 40 of them. So it gives you a sense of how much we can do remote, which we now know we can do a lot more remote than we could before, but we do like to have that in-country presence. So.
Great. We have some questions for Kim. So the Carter Center addresses trachoma in 5 African countries. Does it exist elsewhere? And if so, are there plans or invitations to expand to more countries?
Well, I'm of course pushing for any of the places where there's like tropical, beaches, because that of course would be under my purview. As you saw in the presentation, about 90% of the global burden is actually found in Africa, but there are some places in Asia and some that they're finishing up in South America. But most of the burden is in Africa. There's the International Coalition for Trachoma Control, which is a coalition that was established to really push this elimination of trachoma effort forward. There's about 50 members. The Carter Center is one of them, and my other counterpart, Angelia Sanders, is the chair of that coalition. So that coalition is working together in partnership to try to clear the map of trachoma. And so there is other need elsewhere, but it's not necessarily unfulfilled need. There are other partners fulfilling that. I think currently the Carter Center is we're trying to get Mali to the end. We're so close in reaching elimination in Mali, just 2 districts left to show that we've taken care of it and helping the country to ensure that the system is in place to identify any incident cases of TT. The same with Niger, we're getting very close. We're sort of looking at expanding in South Sudan because there is a great need there. There is we want to complete the map. If we want to know what needs to be done, we need to map it or do these baseline surveys. So that is one of the elements that we're looking at, is how can we look into expanding into South Sudan. In Amhara, though we're made great progress, there's a lot of need left to do. For TT, I didn't talk about it, but we have to do house-to-house case finding for TT as well, because as we get closer to the end, it's harder and harder to find those last cases. So we have case finders going house to house, screening millions of people to try to find the last cases of TT. So currently our plate, I think, is full, but of course we're always looking for further expansion, because though there's a lot of partners working on the ground doing this stuff, there's always going to be a little bit more need, and that, as we know with guinea worm, that last mile is the most difficult to reach. So thanks.
And why is it control and not eradication?
So trachoma is, there will always be a little bit, some people will say they want to, complete elimination, bringing it down to, where we say bringing it down so it's no longer
public health problem. So there's two indicators for disease that we use. One is trichomonas inflammation follicular, or TF for short, and we're aiming for 5%. For TT, it's bringing it down under 0.2%, or about 1 per 1,000 population. The idea being that it's not going to be a public health problem where it's running rampant and causing blindness. So to get down to 0, as we know, for guinea worm, for example, for eradication, or bringing it down so that there's no disease milling about is very difficult. And I think the global program has established that if we bring it down to those levels, which considered control, but we call it elimination of trachoma as a public health problem, our goal is preventing people from going unnecessarily blind from trachoma. And that's if we bring it down to below 5%, you're not having this constant circulation of infection, and people aren't constantly developing this TT, which will result in blindness.
Yeah, and let me just add, because President Carter has always said there are no neglected tropical diseases, there are only neglected people. And so that is one of the reasons why we reach out to some of these areas. I would say the data analytics piece, to meld what Michael is saying and what Kim has said, our data analytics, Dr. Kashif Ijaz, who is our new VP for Health, not so new, he's coming up on a year next month, came from CDC. And this is one of the areas where, as Michael has laid out what we've been trying to do to innovate and modernize and looking at how social media affects some of the work we're doing, we need to do the same thing on the data analytics side. We need better metrics, we need to not work off Excel spreadsheets, and that's something that Kim and her team are doing as well.
We have a question for Carrie. So through the fellowships that the Carter Center has promoted, have you seen other countries or other nonprofits get stood up in, or fellowships stood up in other countries to advance mental health because they were inspired by the Carter Center and the fellowships we've been supporting in media and journalism?
That's a good question. I think one of the things that we try to hold true to at the Carter Center is that we don't duplicate the work of others. And so our program is unique in that while we were established in the US, we have also established the program in other countries. So we've been in, I think as I mentioned earlier, Romania, New Zealand, South Africa. We're currently in Colombia, which was expanded over the last 2 years to include all of Latin America, and 2 countries in the Middle East. And so we're in the process right now of looking at other countries within Eastern Europe, I would say, without giving too much away, to establish the program. We found that the programs that we have established, we work with them on sustainability. So for example, our partnership with our folks in Colombia ended last year, and they're continuing to award fellows. And a few of our programs in other countries are doing the same as well. So in terms of if we have inspired other programs like ours, I'm not sure. I'm not aware of any that are as robust as ours. But I will say that I think from 1996 to today, the work of the fellows has directly contributed to raising the public discourse around mental health. And I think the conversations that we have now around mental health look very different than they looked in the mid-90s. And I think that the coverage that we have seen that's been sparked by our fellows has proliferated that trend of continued mental health reporting, but also appropriate mental health reporting that does not, that helps reduce stigma.
Yeah, and I'll also add that there's a crossover between the mental health and the peace programs as well. We had, before I took this job, I was informed by a colleague in Romania that he had just been awarded a mental health fellowship from us, but he was also given an award from another organization for that coverage that he had. And he actually works at the Institute of War Reporting. So it was a perfect configuration of both the peace side of the house and the health side. So I'm actually going to be respectful of time, and unless there are any more questions here, I'm going to hand it back over to Sham to close out and try to give everyone a few extra minutes. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Paige. Thank you, Jason. You know, it's such a pleasure to be serving in a leadership position along two close friends, both of whom are making the world a better place than we found it, along with our colleagues here on the stage and everyone else at the Carter Center. You know, before I close out, and I'd be remiss if I didn't thank the 3,000 plus Carter Center employees. I know the folks who work at the Carter Center, you know, they're under the radar, they want to be under the radar, they want to do good work, and they just want to you know, be a shining light for the rest of the world, and are definitely not seeking praise. But at the same time, I think it's important that we recognize their contributions to society, the world at large, and humanity, quite frankly, especially given the world we're currently living in. You know, I'd characterize them all as diplomats, as peace ambassadors, as public health heroes, and as guiding lights. Without their tireless service, especially in the middle of a pandemic, many folks in Africa, the Middle East, and other regions of the world, including the United States, wouldn't have had their freedoms advanced, their health needs met, and their democracy preserved. Instead, all of these folks and their families have persevered and are better off, thanks in large part to the work of the dedicated staff at the Carter Center. And so we are grateful for everything that you're doing. On behalf of the Carter Center Board of Councilors, it is such a privilege and honor to be on your team. And thank you for all that you're doing to wage peace, fight disease, and build hope. You know, and before I close, there are only a couple of things that we ask of our Board of Councilors, but I'd like to hone in on that mission statement of the Carter Center, and that's, you know, that's waging peace, fighting disease, and building hope. And that isn't, I mean, that seems to be so relevant today in light of the pandemic we're living in, the divisive nature of our environment, and on top of what's going on across the world, and of course the optimism that we all should be striving for and living by as we go about our lives. So as counselors, I would ask that you take that mission to heart, and in your everyday lives, and on behalf of the Carter Center, promote that mission, because we're in positions where we can have incredible influence. So I ask that you not only do that, but we hope that you're able to make the next meeting on Friday, December 3rd. That will be our last meeting of the year. And remember that we only ask two things of our members: that we attend meetings, and that we proactively support the center in those circles in which we have influence. And through that, I would encourage you to live out the Carter Center mission, because like I said, I think we can continue to have a tremendous impact and be an extension of the center as we do so. Tell someone today about the important work we're doing, and thank you, and hope all of you have a great and wonderful weekend.